Before a cowboy ever drew his pistol, he was thinking about his next meal. Real frontier survival wasn't romantic, it was desperate, creative, and often stomach-turning by modern standards. The meal that ranked first on this list wasn't steak. It wasn't whiskey. It was something every trailhand carried in his memory long after the cattle drives ended, something so simple it had no business tasting as good as it did after 3 weeks on open prairie. These aren't the meals Hollywood put on screen. These are the ones that actually kept people alive. 10. Jackrabbit stew. Jackrabbits were everywhere on the southern plains and they cost absolutely nothing to obtain. A practiced hand could snare 3 or 4 before the sun fully cleared the horizon, using nothing more than a length of wire and the kind of patience that frontier life either taught you fast or didn't teach you at all. They were so abundant across Kansas and Texas grasslands that hunters sometimes considered them a nuisance rather than a food source until the food ran out, which it always eventually did. Saloon cooks who found themselves short on beef, which happened more often than the ledgers liked to admit, threw jackrabbit into a heavy cast iron pot with whatever root vegetables were available. Wild onions pulled from creek banks, dried peppers traded from Mexican merchants, the last of the previous night's beans. The pot went over a low fire and stayed there for several hours, sometimes most of the day, until the tough, lean meat surrendered and broke apart into the liquid. What came out was darker and stronger than chicken soup, with a gamey depth that divided people cleanly into those who loved it and those who tolerated it. The flavor was genuinely good if you were hungry enough, and on the frontier, nearly everyone was hungry enough. Billy the Kid spent his formative years in the silver mining camps of New Mexico, where jackrabbit was eaten more frequently than beef by a wide margin. Pat Garrett, the lawman who eventually tracked him down, grew up under similar conditions in the same territory. They almost certainly ate from identical pots on different nights in different towns, ordered by the same hunger, served by cooks who never asked about a man's history before handing him a bowl. Nobody wrote a dime novel chapter about jackrabbit stew. That is precisely why it belongs on this list. 9. Roasted corn with lard and salt. This was frontier cooking reduced to its absolute essential logic: take what grows, apply fire, add fat and salt, feed people. Nothing about it was complicated. Nothing about it needed to be. Ears of corn were stripped of their husks, rubbed thoroughly and rendered lard, the universal cooking fat of the American West, present in every kitchen from Missouri to the Rio Grande, and held directly over hardwood coals until the kernels blistered and charred at the tips while the interior stayed dense and sweet. Salt was the only seasoning, applied immediately after pulling the ear from the fire while the lard was still liquid enough to carry it into every groove. The result was something that required no plate, no utensil, and no time. A man could eat it walking, eat it standing at the bar, eat it while conducting whatever business had brought him into town. Saloon owners in Abilene charged 2 cents an ear throughout the 1870s and reportedly never had difficulty selling every single one they prepared. What made roasted corn remarkable in the context of frontier food was its texture. The charred exterior introduced a slight bitterness that the natural sweetness of the corn pushed back against, creating something more interesting than either quality alone. After weeks of food that was uniformly soft, boiled beans, salt pork, trail mush, something with genuine bite and variation became almost startling. Cowboys who ate it in silence were not being rude. They were paying attention. On the frontier, paying attention to a good meal was the highest form of gratitude a cook could receive. The simplicity was the point, and the point was never lost on anyone who ate it. 8. Smoked venison jerky. Before refrigeration reached the frontier, which is to say, for the entire period that defines the Wild West, jerky was not a convenient snack. It was a survival architecture. Saloon cooks and trailhands who processed their own game understood something that has mostly been forgotten in the modern era. Properly made jerky represented weeks of riding distance compressed into something that fit in a coat pocket and required no fire, no water, and no preparation of any kind to consume. Venison was the preferred meat because deer were available within a few miles of almost every frontier settlement year-round, their populations barely dented by the level of hunting that was practically possible with the firearms and transportation of the era. The backstrap and hindquarters were cut into long, thin strips following the grain of the muscle, then rubbed with a mixture of coarse salt and whatever dried chili was available. New Mexican red in the southwest, black pepper and salt alone in the northern plains. The strips went into the smokehouse over mesquite or juniper for 2 to 4 days depending on thickness, temperature, and the cook's judgment about how long they needed to last. The result was shelf-stable for months in dry conditions, nutritionally dense far beyond its modest appearance, and flavored with a smoke intensity that modern commercial jerky hasn't come close to replicating. The chili worked its way into the protein during smoking and emerged on the palate several seconds after the first bite, building slowly in a way that made men reach for their canteen and then reach for another strip anyway. Cowboys carried it out of saloons the way modern travelers grab food at an airport gate, not because it was the meal they wanted, but because it was the meal that would exist when everything else didn't. It was the last line between a man and nothing, and every man on the frontier knew exactly what that meant. 7. Pozole. In the Mexican-influenced territories that covered everything from Texas to California, pozole was the meal that crossed every border the frontier had drawn. It was not a saloon invention. It was centuries old before the first American cowboy arrived, developed by indigenous and Mexican communities who had understood the nutritional transformation that happens to corn when it is processed in lime water long before any Anglo-settler thought to ask about it. The process, called nixtamalization, changed dried corn into hominy, blooming the kernels into something larger, softer, and nutritionally richer than the original grain. Pozole required time. Dried hominy soaked overnight, then simmered for most of a day with pork and dried red chiles until the kernels split open at the crown and the broth turned deep red and deeply complex. The flavor was earthy and starchy and warming in the specific way of food that has been built slowly rather than assembled quickly, a flavor that registered somewhere deeper than the palate, closer to memory or instinct. Female vendors, many of them Mexican or Tejano women who represented some of the most skilled cooks in the entire frontier economy, prepared pozole in large clay pots and sold it from outside saloon doors in the silver mining towns of New Mexico and Arizona. Some pushed carts through the saloons themselves, moving between gambling tables and the bar with the ease of people who understood that hunger didn't care about the legal status of the establishment they were standing in. Pat Garrett bought from these vendors. So did the men he was hunting. They may have handed coins to the same woman on different days of the same week, eating the same food from the same pot, separated by nothing but timing and the particular direction their lives had taken. 6. Prickly pear syrup over fried dough. This one requires a moment of genuine respect for the cooks who figured it out. Prickly pear cactus grew in dense abundance across the desert Southwest. New Mexico, Arizona, West Texas, producing fruit every summer in shades of deep red and vivid purple that looked almost theatrical against the dry brown landscape. The fruit was edible, intensely colored, and sweetly tart in a way that bore no resemblance to anything else growing in that environment. The problem was the preparation. The outer skin carried thousands of nearly invisible fine spines called glochids that embedded in skin and were almost impossible to remove once they made contact. Processing prickly pear required patience, thick gloves, and the willingness to spend an afternoon on a task that most trail cooks didn't have time for. The saloon cooks who took the trouble ended up with something nobody else was offering. The fruit, once carefully cleaned and boiled down with a modest amount of sugar, reduced into a syrup of such vivid color and concentrated flavor that it stopped men mid-conversation when they saw it being poured over fried dough. Thick rounds of lard fried sourdough that came out of the pan golden and slightly crisp, it created a combination of textures and flavors that was genuinely unlike anything else on a frontier menu dominated by brown, heavy, utilitarian food. In Tucson and El Paso in the 1880s, chalkboard menus began listing prickly pear dishes as specific attractions rather than incidental items. Men who came in for whiskey and cards ordered it because they saw it on the board and couldn't quite picture what it was. They came back the following night because they now knew exactly what it was. That is the best possible outcome a frontier cook could hope for, turning curiosity into loyalty with a single plate. 5. Bison liver with wild garlic. Here is where the list asks something of the modern reader. Fresh bison liver, seared fast over a mesquite fire and eaten within hours of the kill, was considered by the hunters and plainsmen of the 1870s to be among the finest things the frontier produced. Not a necessity. Not a consolation. A genuine delicacy, sought out and valued by men who had access to every other cut of the animal and specifically chose this one. The context matters enormously. The American bison population stood at an estimated 30 million animals in 1870. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 survived. The hunters responsible for this near extinction were operating a commercial enterprise built on specific markets: hides for eastern tanneries, tongues for restaurant trade, and organ meat for the men doing the hunting, who took the liver first because it was the most immediate reward for a kill. It was sliced thick, laid directly on a flat rock positioned over coals, and salted from a pouch carried in a vest pocket. Wild garlic, which grew along watercourses throughout the plains, went in alongside it. The flavor of fresh liver from a wild, grass-fed animal is different in kind from anything produced by modern commercial livestock: richer, more mineral, more distinctly animal, without the bitterness that comes from stressed or grain-fed cattle. Buffalo hunters understood this without being able to articulate the biochemistry behind it. They just knew that the liver was the first thing worth eating and the thing they'd think about afterward. Saloons near the hunting grounds served it on the day of a kill. By the following afternoon, both the liver and the bison that had provided it were gone. That pattern, repeated across 2 decades and 30 million animals, is one of the quieter catastrophes in American food history.